So we have looked at the comparison and logical operators. We've looked at the selection structures. We kind of played around with them at the interactive site. And now we are going to take a look at repetition structures. So we have while, do while, for, and for in. We will be using this example site in a minute. We're just going to quick talk about some of these structures first. So the while loop is probably the one that's most commonly used. It tests for a condition, and as long as that condition is true, it executes actions that are within the curly brace. Now, typically at the bottom of the while loop, the very last action is a counter or a prompt, because you need some way of making the condition test false. So if it's a counter, you're using something called counter-controlled repetition. Okay? And then you typically have a variable that you identify as a counter, and you're going to stay in the loop as long as the counter is below a particular number. And you'll notice the very last thing in that loop is incrementing the counter. Okay, so all this is going to be doing is prompting the user for the item cost. The item cost then is converted into a number, because anytime you enter a value into a text box or a prompt window, it is text and not a number. So you have to use some kind of math function to convert it. Math seal is one of the ways of doing that. So we are taking the cost, converting it to a number, and adding that number into the total cost. And you'll notice that we initialized item cost and total cost. We also initialized counter. Okay, so we basically are giving them good values to start with. Once we are out of the loop, it's going to display back what it calculated for total cost. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and run this. And it doesn't like it when I use my middle button on my mouse, so we'll reload here. The item cost is going to be added to the total. So we're going to do this really simple, because we said it's going to go through 5 times. So I'll make the first one 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Okay, so the total cost is 150. And that would be correct. So counter, the key for this to work is if you set the counter to 1, you're going to use less than or equal. And if you set it to 0, you're just going to use less than. Okay? That way you're not going to get the off by 1 issue. So if you set it to 1, we say less than or equal to 5. First time through, the counter is a 1. Second time through, it's a 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 is still less than or equal to 5. Okay, so it's going to go through that 5th time. If you set the counter to 0, you want to use less than, because the first time through the counter is going to be 0. Second time through, it'll be 1. Third time through, it'll be 2. Fourth time, it'll be 3. Fifth time through, it'll be a 4. When it gets to the 6th time, it's going to be a 5. Okay, so if you start the counter at 0, you always use less than. If you start it at 1, it's less than or equal to. Now, Sentinel controlled repetition happens when you have no idea how many times to execute the loop. Okay, it's kind of up to the user. So with Sentinel controlled, you typically have either a string or a character or a number that the user has to enter in order to stop the repetition. So it could be like a -1, it could be a Q to quit, it could be an N, which would be no more or stop, an S to stop, whatever you decide that Sentinel should be, okay, that is what you would code. So in this little example, we don't know how many items need to be added into the total. So we're going to use a Sentinel. So I've got a little variable I called go. I set it to Y. And then we're going to stay in the loop as long as go doesn't equal N. So this is an example of where I use not equal to. Okay, it's about the only place I use not equal to. Okay, so I want to stay in the loop as long as go doesn't equal to N. Okay, so at the end here, you'll notice this is where I'm prompting them, hey, enter an N to stop, any key to continue. So we can go ahead and run this. Let me reload it. Oh, actually, enter an N to stop. Okay, I don't need to reload. Any key to continue. All right, so enter the item cost. Let me see, we'll do a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now let me do an N. Okay, total cost is 9. Okay, so this is kind of nice because it totally lets the user control when they stop. So summary of repetition controls, we have counter controlled, we have Sentinel controlled. If you use counter controlled, what I tend to use, and you guys will have a preference, I'm sure, is I tend to do the plus plus after the counter to add 1 to it. Okay, so that is an increment operator, and you can put the pluses before or after, but it does affect, when it's checking the condition, it affects the value of the number. Okay, so counter equals counter plus 1, plus plus counter, counter plus plus, counter plus equal 1. They all will add 1. Okay, it's just different ways of doing it. Sentinel controlled, that's pretty straightforward. You basically have a character they have to key to stop the loop.